since I've been getting shortness of breath and heart palpitations. Feel my chest.
Not tonight, darling. I have a headache.
There is a scene in MASH that most people remember as funny. Hawkeye Pierce is standing in the mess tent, coffee in hand, cracking a joke so sharp and so perfectly timed that the whole tent erupts. He's grinning, he's charming, he's the guy everyone wants to be around. And the camera loves him for it. The audience loves him for it. For 11 seasons, America loved him for it. But here's the thing that I can't stop thinking about. That grin never quite reaches his eyes, and once you notice that, once you really sit with it, something shifts. The whole show shifts. Because Hawkeye Pierce wasn't a comedian who happened to be in a war. He was a man quietly drowning in one, and the only life raft he had was laughter, and nobody, not the show, not the other characters, not us, ever really stopped to ask if he was okay. This is the truth about Hawkeye Pierce that we all ignored. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the pilot, not the first season. I mean the actual beginning. The emotional foundation of who this man is before the war even starts. Benjamin Franklin Pierce grew up in Crabapple Cove, Maine. Small town, close-knit. His father, Daniel Pierce, was a country doctor. And from the moment Hawkeye was old enough to understand what his father did, he understood one thing clearly. You show up for people, you carry their pain, you fix what's broken, you give everything you have and you don't complain, because complaining means you're making it about you, and it was never supposed to be about you. That's not a lesson he was taught in a classroom, that's a lesson he absorbed in the bloodstream.
I looked around the room, and there, sitting over on the windowsill of the classroom, was this little gray squirrel.
It became the architecture of his personality before he was old enough to question it. And by the time he was old enough to question it, it was already too late. The architecture was load-bearing. Remove it and everything falls. There's something else we know about Hawkeye's childhood, something the show drops in quietly and rarely comes back to. His mother died when he was young, very young enough that the loss left a shape in him rather than a memory. He doesn't have stories about her the way people with memories have stories. He has an absence. A specific permanent silence in the place where a parent should be. And you can hear that silence in the way he never quite talks about her directly, not with grief, not with anger, just with this careful, deliberate sidestepping that looks like acceptance, but is actually something closer to self-protection, because grief you can name is grief you have to feel. And Hawkeye Pierce from a very early age became extraordinarily good at feeling things just enough to function and then moving on before they could swallow him whole. And think about what that does to a child. Not just the grief of it. Grief is survivable. It's the lesson attached to it. The lesson a young kid absorbs when the most important person in his world disappears without warning. The people you love most can be taken from you at any moment. Without explanation, without fairness, without any warning at all. So you hold them loosely. You love them sideways. You make them laugh because making someone laugh is intimacy with a built-in escape hatch. You can always say you were just joking. That's the emotional blueprint Hawkeye Pierce carried into Korea, and then they sent him to Korea. Now here's what the show wants you to think. The show wants you to think that Hawkeye's drinking is funny, that his womanizing is charming, that his rule-breaking is heroic.
When I was 7 years old, we were on that pond,
And in many individual moments, all of those things are true. Alan Alda plays him with such warmth and such intelligence that you genuinely enjoy every second you spend in his company. But sit back and look at the whole picture. This man drinks constantly. He chases women compulsively. He talks almost without stopping. And when he can't find an audience, he performs for himself. He is almost never quiet. He almost never sits still. He's always moving, always talking, always doing something. And I think I've finally figured out why. Because the moment Hawkeye Pierce goes quiet, the war gets in. That's not a joke. That's a coping mechanism. That's a man white-knuckling his way through an experience that would shatter most people, using humor as a wall between himself and the horror on the other side of it. Every joke is a brick. Every one-liner is mortar. He built that wall so fast and so efficiently that everyone around him, including us, started mistaking the wall for the man. Think about the surgery scenes, the ones where he's standing over a table for hours.
Sinners, I believe.
Exactly. There are no innocent bystanders in hell.
Hands inside someone's chest, cracking wise the entire time. People remember those scenes as the show being quirky and fun, and they are quirky and fun. But go back and watch them more carefully. Watch his hands. His hands never shake. His hands never hesitate. While his mouth is performing for the room, his hands are doing something almost inhuman, holding a life together through sheer precision and will. And there's a moment sometimes in the middle of a joke where you'll catch it, a flash across his face, something that's there and then gone in less than a second. Exhaustion, grief, something that isn't funny at all, and then the next line lands and everyone laughs and it's gone. He buried it, right there in front of us. And we laughed along, and that's almost the cruelest part of it. Not that Hawkeye suffered, lots of people suffer, but that he suffered in a way that was constantly mistaken for performance. Every time something real and painful broke through the surface, it came out shaped like a joke. And so it was received as a joke. And he learned, consciously or not, that there was no point in trying to say it straight. Nobody was listening for straight. They were listening for the punchline. So he kept writing punchlines, even when he was breaking. Okay, before we go deeper, I want to stop here and ask you something, because this is the part where I think it gets genuinely interesting. Think about the people in your life who are always the funniest person in the room, the ones who always have a comeback, always have a joke, always know how to diffuse tension with a perfectly timed line. And then think about the last time anyone asked them how they were actually doing. Not, how's it going, as a greeting. Really asked. Really waited for an answer. Drop it in the comments. I want to know, do you think humor and emotional pain always go hand in hand? Or is that too simple? Because I think the answer is more complicated than most people realize, and I genuinely want to read what you think about it. Because here's the thing about Hawkeye that the show slowly, quietly reveals over 11 seasons if you're paying close attention. Nobody actually knows him. BJ knows a version of him. Colonel Potter respects a version of him. Radar worships a version of him. Even Trapper John, the closest thing to a best friend Hawkeye had in the early seasons, knew the performing version. The version that was always on. The version that had the best lines and the most outrageous plans and the biggest laugh. But the real Benjamin Pierce, the one underneath all of it, that man existed almost entirely alone. And I don't think that's an accident. I think Hawkeye constructed that isolation deliberately, because if nobody gets close enough to the real you, nobody gets close enough to see how bad it actually is. And there's something heartbreaking about the fact that the show's ensemble is actually incredibly warm. These are people who genuinely care about each other. BJ loves Hawkeye. Potter loves Hawkeye in that gruff, paternal way that military men carry love. Radar would have walked through fire for him. The warmth in that unit is real, and the show earns every bit of it. But warmth isn't the same as being truly known. You can be completely surrounded by people who love you and still feel completely unseen. And Hawkeye, who was better at performing warmth than almost anyone, made sure that the version people loved was always the one he was comfortable showing. The one that didn't require anything from anyone. The one that gave and gave and gave without ever asking for a single thing in return. Everybody loved him through his performance. Nobody loved him through his pain. Let's talk about the women. On the surface, Hawkeye's romantic life looks like a running gag. He chases nurses. He writes letters to women back home. He falls in what might be love with a married woman, and nothing ever quite works out. It's treated like character texture, like a personality quirk, like one more endearing thing about this endearing man. But look at what actually happens in every single relationship Hawkeye has. He keeps them at arm's length.
Few people who can see things clearly without emotion or prejudice. Let me ask you.
I think you did it.
Every time a connection gets genuinely real, genuinely deep, he either sabotages it, or the circumstances do it for him, or he chooses the self-destructive version of the connection over the healthy one. He doesn't pursue women because he's confident. He pursues them because the pursuit, the flirting, the performance, the moment where someone looks at him like he's wonderful, fills a hole for about 48 hours. And then the hole opens back up again. He was never looking for a relationship. He was looking for proof that he was okay, and that proof never lasted long enough. There's a pattern, if you watch for it. Every time a woman gets close enough to see something real in him, something unguarded and honest, Hawkeye flinches. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would necessarily notice, but he steps back. He makes a joke, he changes the subject, he redirects. Because being truly seen by someone means they could leave with something real, and things that are real, in Hawkeye Pierce's experience, get taken away. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get brought up often enough. Hawkeye's relationship with his father. Daniel Pierce barely appears in the show. He's a voice on a phone. He's a presence Hawkeye references. He's the person Hawkeye writes letters to in his head. But in those few moments when we sense what their relationship actually is, something important reveals itself. Hawkeye idolizes his father. Not just loves him, idolizes him. Talks about him like he hung the moon. Back home, my dad always said, and you can hear in those lines every single time a child who wanted nothing more than to make that man proud. Who became a doctor not just because medicine mattered, but because medicine was the language his father spoke. And speaking it fluently was the closest thing to being truly understood by the person he loved most. That's the emotional foundation of everything. Hawkeye went to Korea carrying a very specific kind of wound, the wound of a man who has spent his entire life performing competence and warmth and strength, because those are the things that earn love, the things that earn belonging. And now he's in a place where competence means cutting people open in a tent, and the warmth has to fight against a wind that smells like blood and burning, and the strength is the only thing standing between him and a complete breakdown. So he keeps performing. Because performing is all he knows, because the alternative, stopping, being still, letting the walls come down, feels more dangerous than anything Korea has actually thrown at him. And I need you to subscribe here if you haven't already. Because what I'm about to get into is the part that most analyses completely skip over, and I genuinely think it's the most important part of understanding who Hawkeye Pierce actually was. If deep emotional character work like this is what you're looking for, hit subscribe. It's all we do here, and I promise it only gets more interesting from this point on. Season 5, Hawk's Nightmare. This is the episode where Hawkeye starts sleepwalking. He's found outside in the middle of the night, in his sleep, acting out scenes from his childhood, playing games, being a kid, completely unaware of where he is or what he's done. The episode is treated as a bit of a medical curiosity. There's concern, there's a visit to Sidney Friedman, there's a resolution of sorts, and the show moves on. But sit with what's actually happening in that episode for a second. This man's unconscious mind is so desperate for relief that it's taking him back to the only time in his life when he wasn't responsible for everything. When he wasn't the one holding it all together, when someone else was the adult and he was just a child playing a game in Crabapple Cove, Maine with no war anywhere near him. His mind was trying to escape while he was asleep, while his conscious defenses were down, and he didn't even know it was happening. That's not a quirky story beat. That's a human being in psychological crisis, and the show gives it one episode and then moves on because the format demands it, and because Hawkeye moves on, and because that's what Hawkeye does. He moves on. He always moves on, because stopping means feeling it. What I find most disturbing about that episode, looking back, is how quickly it resolves. Sidney Friedman says some wise things. Hawkeye processes something, and by next week he's cracking jokes again and nobody mentions it. Because the show needs him functional. The show has always needed him functional. The audience needs him functional. Nobody ever stopped to wonder whether functional was the right word, or whether what they were watching was a man functioning, or a man performing the appearance of functioning so convincingly that nobody could tell the difference. Let me paint a picture for you. It's a Tuesday. Not that Tuesdays mean anything in Korea. The days blur, the surgeries blur, the faces blur. Hawkeye is in the swamp. That's what they call their tent, the swamp. And it's 3 in the morning, and the gin they distilled themselves tastes like paint thinner, and he is telling a joke. He's always telling a joke. And for just a moment before the punchline lands, there's a look on his face that has nothing to do with comedy. It's the look of a man who is so tired. Not physically tired, though he's that too. Tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep can fix. Tired in the way that comes from carrying something you were never designed to carry for a duration you were never designed to carry it. And then the punchline lands. And BJ laughs, and the moment disappears, and Hawkeye takes another sip of the terrible gin and starts the next joke. That's the real Hawkeye Pierce, not the comedy, the 2 seconds before the comedy. I want to talk about his anger because his anger is deeply underrated as a character element. Hawkeye's anger doesn't look like most people's anger. He doesn't throw things. He doesn't shut down. He doesn't go quiet and cold. His anger looks like escalation, like a joke that pushes too far. Like a speech that crosses a line, like a confrontation that was technically about one thing, but was obviously about 12 other things he's been storing up for weeks.
Protest! We've been had! Again!
Son, I'm really sorry.
There's an episode in the later seasons where Hawkeye launches into a full-scale confrontation against a general who's making decisions that are costing lives, and the confrontation is righteous. It's presented as heroic. Hawkeye is right, the general is wrong, lives are at stake, and the audience is cheering. But watch the way Hawkeye does it. Watch the intensity of it. Watch how far past the point he needs to make he actually goes. He doesn't stop when he's made his argument. He keeps going. He keeps escalating. He keeps pushing until someone physically removes him from the situation. That's not bravery. That's a man who found a legitimate target for an anger that had nowhere else to go. That's someone bleeding out emotions that have been locked up for so long they don't come out in measured doses anymore. They come out like pressure through a crack in a dam, fast, forceful, and far bigger than the crack itself. And every time it happens, the show frames it as Hawkeye being heroic, because in that specific situation, in that specific target, he usually is right, but the force of it, the sheer force of it, that force is not about generals and bad decisions. That force is about Korea, about blood, about the screaming he hears on the operating table and then tries to outrun with a joke the second it stops. He was always angry, he just had very few places where expressing it was acceptable. And so when those places appeared, he poured everything into them. Everything. Months of it. Years of it. And the people watching called it courage instead of crisis. And he let them. Because courage was easier to carry than crisis. And maybe that's the loneliest part of all, being someone whose pain is so consistently misread as strength that eventually you stop trying to correct the record. You just wear the label they gave you. You become the brave one, the funny one, the one who always finds a way through, because that's who they need you to be, and you stopped having the energy to argue with it somewhere around year 2. The war didn't just cost Hawkeye Pierce his peace of mind, it cost him the right to fall apart in front of people who loved him, and nobody ever even noticed what they'd taken.
What are you doing? You can't pay the mortgage with nickels.
Let's talk about the finale. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm about to say. Goodbye, farewell, and amen. The last episode of MASH, one of the highest-rated television broadcasts in American history. Hawkeye is in a psychiatric facility working through a breakdown, and Sidney Friedman is trying to help him uncover something, a traumatic memory that Hawkeye's mind has buried and replaced with a version it could survive. The truth, when it finally comes, is devastating. The core of it, Hawkeye witnessed something unbearable, something that required an impossible choice in a moment of absolute terror, and his mind, in order to protect him, altered the memory. Replaced the most horrifying detail with something only slightly less horrifying. Because the real version was too much. The real version was the fracture point. And the moment the memory surfaces, Alan Alda doesn't play it dramatically. He doesn't wail or collapse in the way that scenes like this usually go in television. He just folds inward, quietly. The comedian disappears, the performance disappears, and what's left underneath it is something so small and so fragile that it almost doesn't fit inside the same body we've been watching for 11 years. Because the person we spent 11 years watching was a construction, a brilliant, warm, funny, heroic construction, but underneath it was someone who was genuinely, seriously hurt. From the very beginning, before the war, before Korea, before the operating table and the terrible gin and the endless jokes, he was hurt from the start, and Korea just kept adding weight to something that was already struggling to stand. Here's what gets me most when I think about Hawkeye. He saved so many people, literally saved their lives, hands in their chest, willing them back from somewhere they were already sliding toward.
And doggone if they don't look just like Mildred's holding herself a handful of moon.
Surgeries that ran for hours past human endurance on no sleep and too much alcohol and sheer stubborn refusal to let another person die on his table. And beyond the literal saving, he saved people's sanity. He saved Radar from total isolation with his big brother warmth. He gave Klinger something to laugh toward. He kept BJ tethered to his humanity through the worst stretches of the worst year of BJ's life. He made Colonel Potter feel like more than a bureaucratic placeholder. He was the emotional center of that entire unit, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Everybody leaned on Hawkeye. Nobody held him up. And that's the tragedy the show almost never says out loud, because the show is structured around Hawkeye being the center. He's the protagonist. He's the engine. The story runs through him, which means the story depends on him functioning, which means the story can never really stop and give him what he actually needs, which is what exactly? Someone to ask, someone to genuinely, quietly ask, Benjamin, not the jokes, not the performance, not the line you've been saving all week, how are you actually doing? Nobody ever really asked. And that silence, that 11-season silence, is the saddest thing in the whole show. And I think that's why the finale hits so hard for people who grew up with MASH. Because by the end, when Hawkeye is sitting in that psychiatric facility, piecing together a memory his own mind tried to protect him from, there's a specific feeling that settles over the whole thing. It's not surprise, it's recognition. Of course, this is where he ended up. Of course, the person who held everyone else together for 11 years needed someone to hold him together in the end. Of course, the funniest man in the 4077th was carrying the most weight. Of course, the jokes were a symptom. We just didn't want to see it. Because we loved the jokes. Because we loved him. Because watching someone be brilliant and funny and heroic is so much more comfortable than watching someone slowly come apart beneath the weight of everything they've agreed to carry without ever being asked first. But he was always coming apart, slowly, in plain sight. And that, I think, is what makes Hawkeye Pierce one of the most genuinely human characters that television has ever put on screen. Not because he was heroic, not because he was funny, but because he was both of those things simultaneously with something deeply broken, and he never let the broken part slow down the rest of it. He just kept moving. He kept operating. He kept making people laugh. He kept showing up every single day for everyone who needed him, even when no one showed up for him, especially then. The last shot of Hawkeye and MASH is of him in a helicopter, looking down at Crabapple Cove written in stones on the ground below the 4077th. It's a goodbye left by Radar, who went home earlier, a message from the kid who worshipped Hawkeye arranged in rocks, pointing home. And Hawkeye sees it and breaks completely. Not because it's sad, though it is. Not because the war is over, though it is. Not even because he's finally going home, though that's part of it. He breaks because in that single moment, something genuinely soft and warm reached through everything he'd built to protect himself and found the real person underneath. The one that had been hiding behind 11 seasons of jokes. The one that missed his father and mourned his mother and never quite figured out how to let anyone all the way in. A kid from Maine who just wanted to go home, who spent 3 years being everybody's anchor, who made the world laugh so he didn't have to explain why he was crying. That's who Hawkeye Pierce was. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've always known. We just needed someone to finally say it out loud. Drop your video ideas in the comments. The best ones always come from you. See you in the next one.